Well, howdy, everybody, and welcome to the first Sierra Forum of 2019. I'm Jason Mark. I'm the editor of Sierra Magazine, and we host these regular gatherings so that you, Sierra Club members and supporters and champions, can hear from our activists, our leaders, about what the Sierra Club and our allies are doing to protect and conserve clean air, clean water, a stable climate, and healthy wildlands. Like always, we'll do about 20 to 30 minutes of discussion with our panelists and leave plenty of time for Q&A. If you've got a question for any of the folks today, you can submit that if you're in the Zoom platform using the Q&A box. And if you're joining us from Facebook Live, please post your questions just there in the comments, and we will get to those as well. So 2019 has just barely started, but there's already obviously a lot happening on the environmental front. And with so much happening this year and so much promise to come, we wanted to share with you all the best thinking from the Sierra Club's senior leadership on our legal, legislative, and grassroots priorities for this coming year, and how the Sierra Club plans to continue to oppose the Trump administration's harmful environmental policies. Today, we've got our crack all-star team with us. Michael Brune is the executive director of the Sierra Club. Melinda Pierce is our senior director of federal lobbying and advocacy, and Pat Gallagher leads the Sierra Club's environmental law program. Welcome, you guys. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
So before we go forward into 2019, let's just take a quick glance back at the year that was. And I would love for you all to just reflect a little bit on what happened in 2018, accomplishments and victories, as well as what the learnings were from 2018. And Mike, let's start with you. What's kind of top of your list looking back to 2018?
Well, first, Jason, thanks for hosting the call, and Melinda and Pat, it's always great to be on the webinar with you, and everybody who's watching this or listening in. Thank you, everybody, for all your support, all your activism. As I look back at 2018, I look back a little bit as another fellow human on this planet, as a father of young children, and as someone who spent a lot of nights looking at my phone, reading the news from the day, or early in the morning or in the middle of the night, getting up and reading about what was happening coming from DC, or the latest updates from scientists. And from that perspective, it was pretty bleak. Every day we faced another round of assaults on most of the things that we hold dear, from our special place to our democracy. And then every new major report from the scientific community delivered some pretty bracing news. The interesting thing, though, is that in spite of all of that, I saw the whole environmental community rise up and have a fantastic year. At the Sierra Club, we put a lot of emphasis on holding the Trump administration accountable. And so for every rollback that was attempted, whether it was on mercury protection or mining or carbon standards or coal ash, Pat and his crack team of lawyers and Melinda and her team of lobbyists were effective at rolling back just about every one. We made remarkable progress there in stopping most of those assaults coming from the administration. At the same time, what we were doing is working to make sure that Scott Pruitt wouldn't get away with being the most corrupt and most dangerous EPA official in history. And we were effective. As Pat will detail, the legal work that we did combined with our communications was the single most important reason why Scott Pruitt was kicked out. Ryan Zinke resigned at the very end of last year, in no small part due to the work of the Sierra Club and many of our allies. But in particular, again, the work that the law program did in exposing Zinke and Pruitt were instrumental in making sure that they no longer were in the cabinet secretaries coming into 2019. I would say besides all of that, the area where we made the most progress is the area where we've been making progress. In the electric sector, in 2018, we had more coal plant retirements under Donald Trump than any other years. It was actually the second largest year for coal plant retirements in history. So again, we saw dozens more smokestacks come down and being replaced increasingly with clean, renewable energy. We also made a lot of progress in pipelines, which I'll talk about later on. And we continue to do a lot of work training our activists, training new volunteers to help them be a part of an effective national and global environmental movement. I would say for me, and I'll close with this, the big lessons for 2018 were in part that grassroots volunteer engagement is what brings victories almost every time. What we saw at the local level in stopping new gas plants from being built in Southern California, to retiring existing coal plants in places like Indiana, very conservative districts in Indiana, we saw how local grassroots activism was able to be deployed in conjunction with our legal team and our lobbyist team and our communicators to have amazing results. We also saw some great work being done on pipelines, Mountain Valley Pipeline, Atlantic Coast Pipeline. We're now targeting about 20% of all of the new gas pipelines and oil pipelines, fossil fuel infrastructure that's out there. And this is work that we intend to expand in the new year. So we're excited about that. And then, of course, I have to highlight the work that the Sierra Club did and lots of people in the elections. It was an historic election, returning the House of Representatives to the Democrats, electing a pro-climate, pro-environmental majority who has come in full force and started to shake things up in Washington, D.C. And then not to be discounted, the work that was done at the state level. We have 14 governors who have made commitments to 100% clean energy, 10 of which are in states that have Democratic majorities in both state legislatures. So we have an opportunity at the state level to make dramatic progress, to make more progress than we've ever made before, whether it's in California, Nevada, Washington, New Mexico, Illinois, Michigan. We have New York, a lot of work that can be done and a lot of progress that can be made on our priorities moving forward, in part because of the change in leadership that we're seeing at the state and the local level. So I think a lot of us here at the Sierra Club are very clear-eyed about the threats and the challenges that we face in 2019, but we're feeling pretty strong and optimistic about our chances to have an even better year this year than we have in the last couple.
Thank you so much for that, Mike, for that really encouraging review. And yeah, it's amazing to think about how much airspace Scott Pruitt took up the first half of the year, and now will be a Trivial Pursuit clue in the future. Melinda, I'd love to hear from you some of the learnings that you had from 2018 and what the Sierra Club and allies were doing on Capitol Hill in terms of legislative resistance. And I'd also love you to talk about what Mike was saying, just the upswelling of grassroots advocacy and how you saw that play out on Capitol Hill.
Sure, yeah, you bet. Thank you, Jason. There are two sort of avenues to talk about. One is certainly Capitol Hill from my perch here in Washington, D.C. And then there's also the resistance against the Trump administrative agenda. And speaking to the sort of this resuscitation of grassroots activism and resistance, we really saw that in DC around the administrative rulemaking process and also out in the hearings, so that were out in the field. Trump came in hell-bent to undo the Obama climate legacy and really targeted every clean air, clean water rule, all the progress that we had made over the last 8 years to, in fact, make our air cleaner and our environment safe and healthy. And as Trump moved, as Pruitt moved, as Zinke moved to try and roll back these protections, the Sierra Club was actively mobilizing the public to turn out at public hearings and testify in places as not necessarily friendly as one would think in West Virginia and some mining country in Colorado. Again, this outpouring of citizen activism, wanting to be heard, wanting to stop the Trump agenda. And for the large part, and I'll let Pat talk about some of the legal victories here, for the large part, the Trump administration has yet to undo some of those key rulemakings. And so that battle continues. But also on Capitol Hill, because we had Republicans and a Republican House and Republicans sitting at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, we were very worried about the kind of legislative agenda that they might be able to deliver on. And although the House continued its campaign to pass really bad ideas, anti-environmental bills, attacking clean air, clean water, attacking some of our protections of national monuments and parks protections, et cetera. That continued, and we didn't have the votes in the House to stop it. However, in the Senate, there was that Senate Great Green Firewall of more than 40 senators consistently that really meant that the bad agenda was stopped dead in its tracks. So as I look back at 2018, both legislatively and also the administrative agenda, we held the line. We defended the progress we were making.
Thanks so much for that, Melinda. And yes, that green firewall kept a lot of really bad things at bay. I just want to remind folks who are joining in, if you have a question for Melinda or Mike or Pat, if you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A toolbar there. And if you're on Facebook, drop it there into the comments on Facebook, and we will try to get to it. So Pat, I wonder if you could talk about then the legal resistance. And Mike mentioned a little bit, but I think you know, one of the real highlights, and I'd love for you to tell people about how it all happened, is stopping some of these really controversial fracked gas pipelines, like the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and some other attempted rollbacks of public health and environmental rulemaking. So Pat, how did it all happen last year, and what were the learnings for you?
Thanks, Jason. Well, let me talk about corruption first. When Trump got elected and then he put Scott Pruitt in and Ryan Zinke in, because of our experience with Dick Cheney and other people, the first thing that came to our minds was, well, let's launch a Freedom of Information Act campaign. So we started filing FOIA requests, and just like Donald Trump doesn't want anybody to see his tax returns, they sure didn't want us to see Scott Pruitt's communications about Chick-fil-A and hotel beds and whatever, just really bizarre stuff. So we uncovered all that, we fed it to the press, and next thing you knew, Scott Pruitt was running tail between his legs out the door. Same thing happened with Ryan Zinke. You know, and one of the key learnings here is these guys are really stupid. I mean, I hate to be so blunt about it, but that's just the fact. And when you talk about the regulatory rollbacks, what they tried to do, at least from the get-go, was just kind of wave their hands. Oh, we're going to suspend this law. We're going to suspend that law. We had to drag them into court time after time. And thank God there are still a bunch of rational judges on the federal bench. And they basically just stopped them cold. Like when they tried to suspend the methane rules. Boom. No way. You can't do that. So now what they're trying to do is they're trying to go back through and actually follow the law, do the procedure, invite public comment. But then, because they're stupid, what they do is they issue new rules that have no scientific justification, that are a 180-degree turn from what Obama did. So what do judges do now? They look at the decision and they say, well, what's the rationale? You're doing a flip-flop, you have no science, so boom, you're out of here. So we're starting to see a lot of successes even when they do follow procedure. So that's a short story there. On the pipeline front, this is basically just a symptom of the fossil fuel bender that Trump and all of his cronies are on right now. They can't find enough places to drill, dig, destroy, get into pipelines, get it to export terminals, whatever they can do to make money, they're doing it. So what do we have to do? We have to launch a full-out, multifaceted campaign, because one lawsuit isn't going to do it. On the pipeline front, we've had to file, I don't know, a dozen lawsuits, clean water, clean air, land use, you name it. So we come at these from every possible angle, state law, federal law, administrative law, whatever it is, because these guys have a lot of money, a lot of patience to get their fossil fuel agenda through. And so we got them with a really sophisticated, multi-pronged approach. And that's what won. We have shut down Atlantic Coast Pipeline. We have won Keystone XL. We knocked Keystone XL back. We knocked back the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And this is a testament not just to the lawyers, but to all the people on the ground, the property owners, the activists, the people who are willing to come out and camp out on pipeline routes. You know, we can't do this alone, so we really rely on that grassroots pressure. Finally, clean energy. We're not getting stuff done at the federal level, so we're going to the states. And it's not just the electric sector. We're making progress on the transportation sector as well. A couple of highlights there. On the clean energy electric sector front, we're starting to convince real conservative people, Arizona Corporation Commission, Indiana Public Service Commission, they're starting to get it. Clean energy is cheaper. Over a 10 to 20 year timeline, when they're starting to make their plans for 2030, 2040, they're starting to buy that clean energy is the way to go. So we're starting to get these amazing decisions out of these commissions saying, no more fossil fuels, we're going fully clean. In the electric vehicle sector, we have this bizarre, strange bedfellow relationship with the electric utilities because they see their market share declining. They want to sell electricity. Well, why don't you sell electricity to cars? Well, why don't you build out the electric vehicle infrastructure and then you can sell electricity to move cars? And so they're all over it. So now we're getting into utility commissions and convincing them to build out electric vehicle infrastructure. That is literally exploding off the map. So I'll stop there. Lots of good news, though.
Thanks so much, Pat, for sharing that good news. I guess one of those learnings is that, at least in the short term, the Trump administration incompetence might save the planet. I want to now turn to 2019. There's a lot of questions coming in from the audience, but I do want to talk about 2019. And one question that is obviously on people's minds, Mike, and I'd love for you to talk about this, is all of the enthusiasm, the conversation, the chatter around various Green New Deal proposals, and what that means, what it looks like, and how the Sierra Club is trying to play a productive role there.
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. By the way, folks, if you see me typing when we're doing this, I'm not being rude. I'm not doing emails. I'm not working on my son's Little League drafts, which is tonight. But I'm trying to answer some of the questions coming in. So keep the questions coming, and we'll all do our best to give some answers either here or in writing. But the Green New Deal. So it's obviously kind of sprung on the public consciousness in the last couple of months, although it's been a concept that's been around for more than a decade and talked about in different ways. Right now, it's become such a popular topic that you have lots of different candidates or elected officials or NGOs who have their own perspective on it. What is common among almost all of them is almost like a stimulus package, a way in which we can redirect public and private funds to make an amazing amount of progress on climate change. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is probably the leading figure in advocating for a Green New Deal. She has come into Congress, obviously, in the last couple of weeks and has done a great deal to elevate the issue of climate change, working with youth that are part of the Sunrise Movement to highlight the urgency of strong action on climate change and lifting up the Green New Deal. What we and many others are advocating for is significant progress on the scale of what's actually needed to get off of fossil fuels, to protect our forests, to protect our soils, and to make dramatic progress on climate change. The Green New Deal would move us to 100% clean, renewable energy, particularly making progress in the electric sector, whereas Pat said the alternatives to fossil fuels are cheaper, they're more affordable, they're more accessible as well than ever before. The Green New Deal would also address the economic and social components of that transition with an emphasis on good, high quality, family sustaining jobs, in particular for the communities that need it most, the communities that have been affected by pollution from fossil fuels, the communities that are currently dependent on fossil fuels and would need some help in a transition to clean energy, and those who are currently employed in the fossil fuel industry. So we have been working on the Green New Deal pretty intensely, particularly over the last 6 months, working both with members of Congress who are advocating for a strong Green New Deal, and there are many of them, both in the House and the Senate, and then working with a lot of the activist organizations who are putting pressure on Congress, talking to all sides to see if we can get some commonality of these proposals and continue to build public support, which includes holding members of the Republican Party more accountable for their inaction on climate change and trying to find some people within the Republican Party that are willing to step out of line with Republican Party leadership, which obviously is a major force of obstruction on this issue.
Thanks, Mike, for that. It's obviously super exciting work. Melinda, obviously the Green New Deal is taking up a lot of heat and light, but there's other things that are happening. And I wonder if you could talk about what are the other 2019 legislative priorities for the Sierra Club.
Sure, and the landscape, of course, has changed dramatically post-election with the new leadership of the House. And so from a purely defensive posture, or mostly defensive posture, with the new leadership under Pelosi, the new chairs, and, you know, a whole slew of progressive, interesting new members of Congress who really want to see some action. We move from that defense to an offensive posture, and we'll be setting the agenda. We'll be holding the kind of hearings that you know, have been tamped down for a number of years, and then we also have the interesting power of oversight and investigation to really dig in to the kind of corruption that's going on in the Trump administration, the corporate influence that we have seen and believe is happening to roll back some of our protections or roll back the clean car standards, for example. So we'll have proactive legislation, we'll have oversight and investigation. And in terms of what that means is we will see, I hope, some movement on, let's take climate, for example. I think an early bill coming out of Nancy Pelosi's leadership in the HR 1 through 10, those first sort of priority bills, will be a bill on climate. We think it'll focus on Paris and putting the House back on record in supporting the goals of the Paris Agreement. You will see likely standalone building blocks on clean energy extenders, smart grid, energy efficiency, batteries. So trying to get a few of these building block individual pieces of legislation going. Certainly Mike mentions, you know, the 100% clean energy, and we'll see that as well. One of the things that didn't happen in 2018 that is likely to happen hopefully soon, and we think as early as next week in the Senate, is action on a package of lands protection bills. So it's a relief to see some of this action. Yes, it's mostly going to be in the House. Yes, some of the best ideas will probably stop cold in the Senate. But in the latter case, this lands protection package, again, we may see action in the Senate. And if that's the case, we may see that package of wilderness bills, park protection bills, wild and scenic, get across the finish line in both houses. And because it's bipartisan, could even get signed by the president. So that's a little flavor.
It's great to see a new political landscape leading to hopefully new protections for our lands and waters. We've got a lot of audience questions piling up here, and I want to make sure we get to them. But before we do, Pat, I'd love to hear a little bit about, again, the environmental law program's 2019 priorities, and maybe just to throw in one audience question here from Cody asking about since Melinda was just talking about lands, what's the status of litigation in regards to the president's attempt to downsize two major national monuments in Utah?
Okay, great. So the monument litigation is midstream. We filed suit a while ago, and it's just trundling along in the federal courts. We probably won't have a decision until later this year. Other priorities on the lands front will be protecting the Arctic Refuge, which is obviously, you know, a treasure, and we've already started to see attempts to explore the Arctic plain, and we've already filed one suit, but there'll be lots more to come. The bender they're on trying to drill everywhere means everywhere across the West, all the BLM lands, Forest Service lands, they're basically trying to open up everything to drilling. So we'll be fighting all that. We've been fighting it. 2019 is going to look a lot like 2018. It's going to look a lot like 2017, because we've been freaked out about climate change for 15 years. That's what led us to fight coal and retire coal. In 2019, we're going to shift a little bit towards natural gas, even though we've already started shifting that way. But you'll see probably a lot more action on natural gas. We'll continue fighting corruption. We'll continue pushing clean energy. We'll continue pushing electric vehicles. So 2019 looks a lot like the past few years. You know, I think, not to be flippant, but you know, it's going to be a lot of the same stuff.
Well, thanks so much, Pat. We got a lot of audience questions here, something like 48 questions. We're not going to get to them all, folks, but we are going to go a little bit longer than we anticipated because we've got so many participants and so many questions. I want to go to a question here from Gary because I know this is on folks' mind. Gary asks, well, Pruitt's gone from the EPA, but Andrew Wheeler is waiting in the wings. Gary asks, better or worse? And what's the 2019 strategy for opposing, various attempts to roll back, various administrative rules? So I don't know who wants to grab that and maybe talk a little bit about what we're going to do to try to resist Andrew Wheeler's agenda.
PFAs.
I'll start, and that is, interestingly enough, Wheeler will have a vote in committee. I think it's next Tuesday, and that's a closely divided committee. They may prevail by a single vote. It will be party line, and the Senate may move very quickly to then a full vote and approve him. And it's true, Pruitt was bumbling and made a lot of mistakes and was largely ineffectual because of it. Andy Wheeler is smarter and won't make those same mistakes. So having him as administrator is a significant threat. And so we will have to continue the kind of investigation into corporate influence, into rulemakings, et cetera. As he moved into that acting role, he continued the Pruitt agenda. He rolled back the glider rule. He rolled back CAFE standards. He's refusing to set a national standards on PFAS, PFOA, a chemical that is extremely poisonous and is in our water supplies. Methylene chloride, stopping international action on HFCs. His agenda is just as bad as Pruitt's, and they may not make the same mistakes. And so the last piece of this is we do now have the power of oversight. We do have the gavel in the House, on the House side, and we are working with various committees to ensure that they are looking closely at the Wheeler agenda, and hopefully that will slow them down and expose some of their mistakes. Others?
Well, one little anecdote from the shutdown. We have a lawsuit already pending to get Wheeler's docs, his communications with lobbyists and industry people. And we got a judge to basically order EPA to come back to work to produce the documents because they basically tried to stonewall us. So we're about to get a bunch of Wheeler documents. Maybe we'll pull up Pruitt again, and he'll find out some weird thing Andrew Wheeler is doing. But I want to, Melinda, I want to ask you, I had read that Wheeler's decision or tentative decision to not set standards for PFAS and PFOAs, those extremely toxic substances, was actually potentially endangering his confirmation. Is that possible?
Yeah, I'd love you to talk about that. I've heard there's even Republican resistance to that because it's so far-reaching and so obviously dangerous to public health and safety.
That's right. And there's some key senators like no friend of the environment, Shelley Moore Capito in West Virginia, some of the North Carolina Republican senators that have real concerns about that chemical contaminant in their states and the lack of action on the part of EPA, and are potentially withholding their vote on cloture for him until they get the kind of answers or hopefully assurances that EPA will move to regulate PFAS.
Yeah, so here's what I'd like to add. So we put together this call with Pat and Melinda. We could have added more people onto the call who work at the state level because this is a good indication of how the Sierra Club works, right? So right now we have Wheeler, who is going through committee, as you just heard, may make it to a full Senate vote. And so our goal right now is we have many different processes underway. In part, what we want to do is what Melinda is largely responsible for, which is to talk to each of these senators to make sure that they're fully informed about what values this particular nominee has. And there are many judgeships, people running different departments and agencies throughout the administration. So in the case of Wheeler, we're being really clear about what his record has been, what he has done since he's been at EPA, what he did before joining EPA. We have a case here where we don't have someone who is close to corporate polluters, but he is a corporate polluter who's being nominated to run EPA. That is combined with a lot of the work that our communications team is doing, which is to dig up more information about who this person is and make it available to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or Fox News or CNN or MSNBC. And then if a person gets confirmed, then Pat and his team goes to work to make sure that all the documents, the communications between agency officials is clear and it becomes public, and that itself gets exposed, while we then work to stop and thwart in the court of law all of the different proposals that have been made. At the state level, what we're doing is we're working at the community level to say, here's who would be affected by this rollback of mercury standards. Here's who is affected by the lack of enforcement of sulfur dioxide. Here are the alternatives to the pollution that this agency is refusing to regulate. So all of this comes together in part in a fight to prevent people from actually being appointed into these jobs or taking these jobs. And if they are, to resist their really toxic agenda, while we're also working to make sure that we are replacing toxic chemicals or replacing fossil fuels with clean energy, trying to win at the local level.
Thanks so much for that, Mike. I think it's really important for people to understand the many, many different tools and strategies and tactics the Sierra Club is using. Mike, I'd love you to, I know this is on a lot of people's minds. We've got a question here from Claire and from Caitlin. I'm going to kind of combine them about what the Sierra Club is doing, or I guess also what the kind of latest is on proposed offshore oil drilling, as well as, and Pat mentioned this earlier when he was talking about the oil and gas binge, also kind of what the latest is regarding the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
Sure. So I spent the weekend down in Santa Barbara with our chapter down there and a bunch of different local environmental organizations to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the spill off of Santa Barbara, which at the time was the largest known oil spill in U.S. history. And we had this gathering in a historic theater in downtown Santa Barbara. More than 1,000 people showed up, in part to commemorate the spill from 50 years ago, but also to get together there to oppose the proposals to reactivate wells off the coasts, on the central coast of California, and then onshore to oppose a tripling of production, which has been put forward by Exxon and other oil producers along the central part of California. What we are seeing, as Pat had said, is a dramatic expansion of oil and gas development on public lands, whether it's in Chaco Canyon or up in the Arctic, or proposals to drill off of almost every coastline in the country. And in a similar way to what we were just talking about, our response is multifaceted. We have our lobby program, which is working to increase the ability for members of the House to exact oversight over the Department of the Interior. We have our lawyers who are working to challenge specific lease sales to prevent companies actually from going onto public lands and drilling or mining. We're working with local community groups to prevent the construction of new pipelines, which would take fracked gas or oil from these particular wells, either to the coasts or to fuel a power plant. And then increasingly what we've been doing over the last couple of years is working both at the local level to make sure that new fossil fuel infrastructure isn't being approved and installed, but also working in the private sector, holding corporations accountable. And in particular in the Arctic, that's been a big priority of ours. We're working with the Gwich'in Native community who has been adamantly opposed to drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for many decades. And we have been traveling around the world, talking with large banks, pension funds, and others who are increasingly agreeing to divest and to not engage in financing, doing any project finance or any loan or any investment in any company that would destroy the Arctic. That's what we need. If we're going to move from a society and an economy that's powered by fossil fuels to one that's powered by 100% clean energy, we're going to need large banks. We're going to need Wall Street. We're going to need private actors and large corporations to be part of the problem and, to be part of the solution and stop being such a big part of the problem.
There's a couple And thank you for hitting on the local angle. There's a lot of questions here from people about people mentioning the Ready for 100 campaigns, mentioning the work at the state and local level. So thank you for mentioning all that, Mike. There's a couple folks here, Lisa and somebody else. Sorry, I missed it here because there's so many questions. Thank you for your engagement. A couple questions here about how the fight is playing out over the Trump administration's proposed rollbacks of tailpipe regulations, of that is car fuel economy standards, and the attack or the planned attack on California's higher standards. And I think it's important for folks just to know that, you know, transportation is now the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions in this country. So obviously a big deal. So wondering if anybody wants to talk about what the Sierra Club's doing or what we see the state of play on auto regulations and, again, the attack on California's standards.
I'm happy to jump in and then others can join me. That's going to be a litigation, you know, just everybody's going to jump in. All the states, us, all the NGOs, once they come out with their final rule, rolling back the CAFE standards. So that's going to go into the courts immediately. And I hope, just like many of the rules, that a rational judge or judges will see, oh, they did a flip-flop and they have no justification. So boom, you're back to the Obama standards pretty quickly, I hope. The other interesting thing is we're not just playing defense, for example, on the California waiver. They're going to try to go after the California's authority, and we'll fight that in the courts. But what we're actually trying to do in the interim is get a bunch of states, I think, was it Colorado is the most recent state, to actually join California, because they can, under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act, they can join California as being a higher, higher CAFE standard state. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out, but we're playing both defense and offense, I guess is the bottom line.
Just a quick input from here in Washington, D.C. What we're doing as lobbyists and leveraging grassroots interests is working with some of those other 14 clean car states to try and mobilize champs to speak out and fight against it using their bully pulpit. So that's one of the things we're doing here.
I want to just hit one more audience question, then I want to make sure everybody's got some time for some closing remarks and to also to give our audience some suggestions and some leadership on what they can do as individuals or as individuals working with other individuals to promote environmental protection. A question both from Ann and Caroline kind of and there's a couple other ones on this same front, get into the intersection of the Sierra Club's longstanding lands protection work and then the necessity of actually drawing down carbon and sequestering carbon. Anne wants to know how we're going to integrate the work to protect forests and ecosystems in the fight against climate. And Caroline's got a question that, of course, is very poignant for us here in California and lots of the West. Caroline points out 2018 was a tragic year for forest fires and community impacts. What can we do in 2019? To help counter the knee-jerk response, we just increase logging. So I wonder if you guys could look out a little bit on the middle horizon and talk about how perhaps our work to preserve lands and waters dovetails and intersects with the efforts to maintain a stable climate.
Mike, you want to start?
Sure. Well, some good questions. Thank you. I think maybe it's useful to talk about this in short term, mid-term, long term. In the short term, clearly, we know that in order to win on climate, we have to keep dirty fuels in the ground. We need to make sure that we're not destroying some of our treasured landscapes, cultural and biological, it's simply to produce just a tiny bit more oil or coal or natural gas. 25% of emissions are located on public lands in the US. So the role of the federal government, as well as state governments, in taking action on climate change should not be limited to just growing more clean energy or taking action internationally. There's a big public lands component that is critical to winning on climate change. The other thing that's true is that almost every conversation around energy and climate change, or every conversation about climate change is usually focused around energy. When we talk about the need to electrify everything and the need to have 100% clean renewable energy to win on climate. But what we also always have to talk about is the ways in which protecting our forests and the ways in which, and how we produce the food and what kinds of food we're eating are also critical components to the climate change issue. And so the Sierra Club has done a lot of work over the last couple of years to think through really carefully what role might we be able to play to encourage more sustainable agriculture? What actions can be taken at the local and state and federal level that would promote more sustainable agriculture, as well as soil retention and helping to produce healthy soils. At the same time, we're also starting to think through from an adaptation perspective, what is the role of wetlands and natural ecosystems in helping our society to adapt to climate change, and to think through what do we need to be doing in order to protect wildlife as well as our natural ecosystems in a changing world. We are actually having a conversation at our board meeting at the end of February about that topic specifically, to think through over the next several years, what might the Sierra Club be doing on adaptation, particularly as it relates to our natural ecosystems? What can we do that would be more powerful and more cohesive as an organization?
Thanks so much, Mike, for that glimpse into the kind of near future. I want to end and give each of you three a chance to offer some suggestions to folks who are on the call, who are Sierra Club supporters, members, champions, but who are not a lobbyist on Capitol Hill and are not an attorney. And what can they do? What can ordinary folks do to, again, protect a stable climate, clean air, clean water, and access to wildlands for all people?
Well, I'll start. And that is, again, informed by my perch here in Washington, D.C., I'm pretty excited about all these new members of Congress, and they really are changing the landscape here in Washington, D.C. And no, you may not be a lobbyist here where I sit, but there's such a renewed focus on real legislating and representing the people's voice. And I think it would be a great opportunity to meet your new member of Congress, to cultivate them, to advocate for the local issues and national issues that you care about. Again, looking back on 2018, it was really exciting to see this resuscitation of the grassroots lobbyist and grassroots engagement. And you don't have to meet them here in DC. You can meet them in the district and weigh in on some of the issues, like, and here's my takeaway, talking about the government shutdown, the impact of the government shutdown, how you may or your district may have experienced it, and the need to pass a clean funding bill with no money for the border wall. And so that's an opportunity that's very live now. But taking that opportunity to meet your new member of Congress would be pretty important.
I'll go next. So number one would be, we have over 100 cities now trying to push clean energy. So if you live in one of those cities, join on because we're going to be ramping up that work to where the cities are going to start to hopefully pressure their states and their public utility commissions to go 100% clean. So that's all super important. Here's a little bit of a wild card. If anybody asks you, why is it so cold in the Midwest if we're suffering from global warming? Tell them that the reason it's so cold in the Midwest is because the upper stratosphere in the Arctic had drastic warming, and that's what pushed all the Arctic air down south. So it is a warming event. It's just in the stratosphere. That's a little bit of a tangent, sorry. If you get an action alert saying call your senator to oppose a judge who's up for nomination or up for confirmation, that means that judge is really bad, because we don't go after all the judges, we go after just the really bad ones. So if you see something like that, please call your senator. And finally, there are so many comment periods, and you probably get fatigued, comment here, comment there. But what they're going to probably, they're doing many things in 2019 that there'll be an opportunity to comment on, but watch out for they're going to try to gut NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. They have designs to do that. So if you see an action alert for that, please engage. It's very important.
All right, so I have three for the question of what folks can do if you are feeling outraged on a daily or weekly basis, or if you are feeling hopeful about the possibilities that exist on a daily or weekly basis. I have three suggestions. First one is to get involved locally. It can be more rewarding to find something that you can identify you specifically want to fight, whether it's a power plant or a pipeline or some really bad idea. Or, as Pat just said, if there's something really positive that you want to advocate for, or both. Getting involved locally is a really effective way to make change. Contact your local Sierra Club chapter or group. Volunteer. The brilliance of the Sierra Club is that you can be the Sierra Club in your own town. You can own the organization as long as you stay within policy guidelines. Don't go proposing new nuclear plants to be built, but you will be the representative for the Sierra Club in your backyard, and your goal should be to bring more people into our movement. So one, get involved locally. Two, to find a way to take action every way that you can, as a voter, as a citizen, as Melinda was saying, as a consumer. Make sure that your wallet is aligned with your values, as an investor or as a divestor. If you have a credit card, if you have a checking account, if you buy electricity, there are ways in which you can make a difference and align your values with your full life, not just by making a phone call every now and then, but get involved fully. And then the third thing is don't give up. There's a lot of bad news out there. It is easy sometimes to feel powerless, but you are immensely powerful. There used to be 530 coal plants at the beginning of this decade, producing 52% of our electricity. 281 of them, more than half of them have been retired. We have defeated pipelines. We have had, as you just heard, more than 100 cities say, we're going to go all the way to 100% clean energy, no coal, no gas, no oil, no nukes. All of that is because of individual people, the members on this call, Sierra Club members across the country and around the world, and other organizations taking action, not falling victim to despair, not believing the hype that we actually can't make a difference, but saying, throughout our country's history, we have been able to work together to achieve great things. We are powerful when we act together, so don't ever forget that. And thank you for being a member of the Sierra Club.
Well, Melinda, Mike, and Pat, thank you guys for taking the time to do this. Thank you so much for this dose of insight and education and inspiration. I really appreciate it. I know everybody who joined the call did as well. Thanks to all of you who joined us today. I apologize we could not simply get to 75 questions, but I really appreciate your enthusiasm, your curiosity, and your passion. And if you've got those questions, you know where to find us. We're online all the time, sierraclub.org. We're obviously on Facebook and other social media platforms. And as Mike was saying, to get involved, find your local chapter, local Sierra Club group. And that's a way to take your curiosity and turn it into commitment. So thanks so much, and stay tuned for future Sierra forums later in 2019. That's it for today.
Thanks, everybody.